today we are going to figure out what impact Paul had on the early church. So although Paul never met Jesus face to face, his spiritual encounter with God profoundly impacted him and therefore the early church. So Paul impacted the church in three ways. First, he shaped the church's theology. Second, he shifted the church from a Jewish institution to a Greco-Roman institution. And third, he created the structure of the church. So first, before we dive into how Paul impacted the church, let's learn a bit about this guy, Paul. So Paul was a Jew, particularly he was from the sect of the Pharisees, and Paul was also a Roman citizen who grew up in Tarsus. So in Acts, Paul says that I am the son of a Pharisee and I am a Pharisee. And let's notice how Paul, after his conversion, still considers himself to be a Pharisee. So this is kind of impacts Paul a lot, his background as a Pharisee. And then he is also a citizen of Rome, as I said, which gave him certain rights to a fair trial. So when he was accused of things and persecuted, he was allowed to have a fair trial in Rome. He was allowed to request that. And also, as I said, Paul grew up in Tarsus, where he learned and studied under Gamaliel, who taught him a lot that influenced his writings. So now that we have this knowledge of who Paul was, let's look at how Paul shaped the church's theology. We often think of Paul as a missionary, but he was also a theologian, and a lot of the truths that we hold high as pillars of the church today were Paul's theology. And these have become orthodox teachings. So orthodox means correct opinion, but it's also the teachings of St. Paul, which is very interesting because that means that Paul literally profoundly impacted the theology of the church through his orthodox teachings. So his theology, Paul's theology, often caused a lot of friction with the disciples because here's Paul, this guy who had persecuted the Christians, and suddenly he's like, I had this divine encounter with God, and now I'm a Christian, and I know that you're doing some things wrong. And you can imagine if you were James, the brother of Jesus, or any of the other disciples, you'd be a little taken back by this because you had received clear instructions from Jesus at the Great Commission, but Paul is coming through and saying, no guys, you got it all wrong. I am more, God has spoken to me more. But Paul actually has a lot of validity. He says that, he went up in heaven. We don't know exactly how, if it was a spiritual experience, or he was actually a bodily experience, but God brought Paul up to heaven and revealed things to him, and this gives him credibility for his theology. There's multiple theologies that Paul brings into the church, but the three of them that stand out the most are the theology of God's grace, the importance that Paul placed on the impact of Jesus' death on the cross, because none of the other disciples of Jesus took the exact stance that Paul did, on the importance of the cross. And then thirdly, how Paul interpreted the Old Testament law. So at the time that of the very, very beginning seeds of the church, it was, people were still living by the Old Testament laws. And Paul actually argued that they didn't need to live by those laws anymore because Jesus' death on the cross had fulfilled the law, and he had lived the law perfectly so that they were not bound by it. And so, yeah, that profoundly changed the church and the church's theology that is so commonplace today. So that is how Paul shaped the church's theology. And second, we can see Paul shift the church from a Greco-Roman institution to from a Jewish institution to a Greco-Roman one. So we can see that Paul was well-versed and well-educated by his use of classical rhetorical figures and structures in his writing. So let's look at a few of those. So one of them is from Romans 11:13. Paul says, "I am an apostle to the Gentiles." And Paul was... What? So, oh, yes. That is the other part. So, Paul was an apostle to the Gentiles. He wasn't just coming to convert Jews, but he felt like he was called to non-Jews, and he didn't want to hindrance them from the gospel. So this shifted the church from just this Jewish institution to a Greco-Roman. So it's a twofold thing. The rhetorical structures show the shift, and also the fact that Paul was preaching to the Gentiles. So let's now look at the rhetorical figures. So a few of Paul's metaphors are allusions to Greco-Roman culture or myths or philosophers. So one of them is from 1 Corinthians 5:33. "Bad company corrupts good character." And Menander says, "She loves you not, but pretend she does. Do not forget, bad company corrupts good character." So it's the same exact wording, actually. And then another example of pulling allusions is from Romans 2:14. "They are a law unto themselves." And Aristotle says, "Against such there is no law, for they themselves are a law." So we can see that Paul, through his preaching to the Gentiles and through his use of Greco-Roman rhetorical structures, changed the church from a Jewish institution to a Greco-Roman one. And then thirdly, Paul created the structure of the early church. So if you can remember back to Roman culture, there's a very prevalent idea. I don't know if no, that's not the right word. Anyway, there's a very prevalent idea of the patron and client relationship in Roman culture that was very, very still a thing when Paul was around. So we can see this patron-client relationship in the early church. So, let's talk about Philemon, because Philemon was, we can assume that Philemon was Paul's patron. So, the lecture says, by using the Roman system of patronage in his church plans, Paul used a core aspect of Roman society with the structure of churches. So, he utilizes this institution that was in place, this cultural expectation in the early church, which I think a lot of Christians don't realize because they don't have that knowledge of Rome. So Philemon was a pater familias. Further, the letter might suggest that Philemon was Paul's patron. This makes sense when Paul offers to pay any damage caused by Onesimus. And he concluded that Philemon supported Paul in prison. So that's from Steve Mark Quardot. I don't know. But that's basically saying that Philemon supporting Paul in prison was more than just like being generous. It was part of Philemon fulfilling his role as the patron of Paul. And then also in the first 200 years of the church, people met in house churches, and we can assume that these house churches were the houses of the patrons of the early church. And then Lydia. Let's talk about Lydia. She was a dyer. I can't remember if it was dyer. She was a seller of purple. So that means that this was a sign of wealth. So we can infer by that and by the fact that her whole household was baptized that Lydia was probably a patron, and her household was her clients. And then later when Lydia says, come and stay, this was not just, when she says this to Paul, this was not just her being generous, her hospitable, it was her fulfilling her role as the patron of Paul and the church. So Paul impacted the church in 3 ways. First, he profoundly shaped the church theology. Second, he changed the church from a Jewish institution to a Greco-Roman institution. And third, he created the structure of the early church.